Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We shall begin with the East African anthem. And if it is not ready yet, then I think Nadia, Rashid, you can start us off with the opening prayer.
Thank you very much, Chepkorir. So, tuombe. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin Ar-Rahmanir Rahim Maliki Yawmiddin Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in ihdinas siratal mustaqim siratal ladzina an'amta 'alayhim ghairil maghdubi 'alayhim waladdallin amin. Ya Rabbi, wewe ndo Mungu muumba wa viumbe vyote vya duniani na akhera, mfalme wa wafalme. Tutakuomba jukwaa hili, wanazuoni hawa, wanafunzi wote hawa ambao wako hapo, wasahilishie katika njia yetu ya kutafuta ilmu, uikuze jumuiya yetu ya Afrika Mashariki, utukuze sisi kielimu, tukue na tuzidi kukua siku zote. Sisi wanafunzi tuweze kujifunza kutoka kwa wanazuoni waliokusanyika hapa, na wanazuoni wetu wahifadhi na wazidishe elimu. Amin.
Thank you, Nadia. Is the anthem ready?
Mungu twaomba uilinde Jumuiya Afrika Mashariki, tuwezeshe kuishi kwa amani, tutimize na malengo yetu. Jumuiya yetu sote tuilinde, tuwajibike, tuimarike. Umoja wetu ni nguzo yetu, idumu jumuiya yetu.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Chepkorir, Sambu, and I shall be moderating today's discussion. But before we begin, I would like to thank Kabarak University and the Jumuiya East Africa Community Law Journal team of editors for putting together this webinar. This webinar is organized by Jumuiya East African Community Law Journal, which is a biennial peer-review periodical of Kabarak University School of Law, and whose aim is to offer scholars and practitioners of EAC law a platform to produce and disseminate their research. To this end, I would like to notify you that their call for papers is out under the theme marking 25 years of the treaty establishing the East African Community. So I encourage you to submit your work for publishing into the second volume. Then deadlines for submissions 31st March for full-length contributions and 30th June for short commentaries. Okay, so let's begin the webinar. By way of introduction, Somalia was admitted to the East African Community as its 8th member in an extraordinary summit. It's 22nd, the EAC 22nd Extraordinary Summit of Heads of State and Government on 15 December 2023. Currently, we have, I think, around 58 participants from Jumuiya countries and other places who are eager to understand today this decision to admit Somalia into the East African Community and its implications. Now that we've seen another northward expansion of Jumuiya. Therefore, from this discussion, what we hope to gain is an understanding of the application or accession process for Somalia, the dynamics and implications that come with this accession, and the sustainability of Jumuiya expansion. On 7 March, we shall continue with this discussion, but we shall examine more generally accession. So we will look at countries like the DRC and South Sudan. We hope you shall also join us then. Today, so we have two panelists. Bashir, Dr. Bashir M. Sheikh-Ali is a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Institute for Policy Studies. He holds a PhD from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and a jurist from Georgia State University College of Law in Atlanta, Bashir concentrates his legal practice on intellectual property litigation and procurement, corporate transactions, and trade. He has extensive compliance monitoring experience, including risk analysis and mitigation. Notably, he played an important role in monitoring trade practices of an international consortium of companies. His experience in trade law fuels his interest in issues related to trade blocks, free trade agreements, and their impacts on cross-border movement of goods and services, tariffs, anti-dumping duties, foreign direct investment, and other capital movements. Welcome, Bashir. The other panelist is Dr. Sylvanus Wekesa, who is a research associate with the Africa Leadership Center, King's College, London. He holds a bachelor's degree in history and political studies from Kenyatta University and a master's degree in security leadership and society from King's College, London. Dr. Wekesa completed his doctorate in leadership studies with reference to security and development at King's College, London. His thesis is titled Leadership and the Politics of Borderland Communities, Integration, Peace, and Security in the East African Community. In this thesis, he examined the EAC efforts to address the security challenges posed by the situation of borderland communities in the region. His research is situated in the growing academy of global political groups like EU, ASEAN, BRICS, AU, among others. Wekesa is a regular commentator and analyst for BBC, Al Jazeera, Kenyan local media houses, and regularly writes and publishes articles in various local and international media. Yeah, thank you. So welcome, Wekesa, and welcome, Bashir. We are trying to understand Somalia's accession to the East African community, and I will start with you, Wekesa. Could you explain to us briefly what the process of applying to be a member of Jumuiya entails? What are the timelines? What are the preconditions imposed on a state that wants to join the East African community?
Thank you very much for the opportunity and to have a conversation with all of you. I hope I'm audible enough. So briefly, the East African community as it is right now, it's on its second reformation process. The first one, of course, happens at a time of independence. After all, the original three member partners, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. But the first, let me call it the EAC one, despite its modest efforts to unite the region, it ran into multiple differences. I mean, we can all have a long day discussion as to what led to the collapse of the first East African community in 1977. But the major ones were always, one was the ideological differences between Mwalimu Julius Nyerere and his counterpart in Kenya, Mzee Jomo Kenyatta. There were also the issues of discrepancies in terms of the economic development, which way the countries were going to go. And then the upheavals in Uganda, the overthrow of Milton Obote by Idi Amin, strained relationships, especially between Tanzania and Uganda, forcing Tanzania to invade Uganda to kick out Idi Amin. So that created such a bad blood, and the EAC inevitably collapsed in 1977. However, the process of reforming it never ended. There were multiple commissions set up, bring back the old EAC. And in 1999, the former presidents Daniel Arap Moi, Benjamin Mkapa of Tanzania, and of course, the common fixed asset of the EAC is Yoweri Museveni. They reformed the EAC and it was set up in 1999. Now, one of the major departures for the 1999 reformation was previously, and I will discuss that more later, is that the EAC post-independent was built on how the founding fathers of the three states related to each other. When their differences could not be resolved, the whole union went down. Now, to cure that anomaly, the 1999 treaty decided to say, okay, if you look at all how regional economic communities are formed, there are different normative frameworks that they adopt. So the EAC decided maybe let us call it a people-centered organization as opposed to a state-led organization. I mean, if you look at in theory and in practice, those two things mean differently. So they factored in multiple issues like representation of the people, the East African Legislative Assembly, the East African Court of Justice, to try and at least move it away from being a conversation among the heads of state, bringing the people. And with that, the Article 3 gave a whole criteria of how members become to the EAC. So the original 3 set the ball rolling, and then Rwanda and Uganda applied, Rwanda and Burundi applied to join. They were admitted, and then followed by South Sudan. Then in 2022, the DRC was admitted, and then towards the end of last year, Somalia was admitted. If you look at the treaty, especially Article 3, it gives a criteria on how partner states can negotiate with new members. And any member has the capacity to negotiate to welcome in a new member, in this case. And there is a criteria set out on how does one qualify to be a member of the EAC. One of it is that you have to adhere to the universally principles of good governance, democracy, the rule of law, observance of human rights and social justice, and how will you contribute to the strengthening of the integration of the East African region. Then the obvious one is the geographical proximity and interdependence among the partner states. Of course, if you look at this criteria, sets clear on, especially on good governance. But if you look across the member states of the East, even the original framers, the 3 major partners, they haven't been able to fulfill that criteria, because we still see them grappling with poorly organized elections, there's rampant corruption, there's poor service delivery, there's a multiple abuse of human rights and of citizens. So it is, the normative framework is very good, but theoretically it's a very solid requirement, but the practicality of it is very wanting. So even within the member states themselves, in the old Jesus word, who will be the first person to cast stone against the other one? Because all of them have issues, internal issues to do that. So Somalia joining the EAC, many critics have been saying, you know, Somalia is in such turmoil. Many have called it a failed state. Many have called it because of the security situations of terrorism. Unfortunately, or fortunately, Somalia is in a very good space with its neighbors, because all its neighbors, none of them can actually say they tick all the boxes. So it's in very good company in terms of the membership. So after the joint verification report was tabled and it was adopted, the next thing Somalia did was to sign the Treaty of Accession. Last week, the lower house of Somalia ratified that treaty. It's supposed to go to the upper house. In fact, last week it was 148 against 1 in favor of joining the EAC. So it is expected that when it goes to the upper house, I believe either this week or next week, then they will ratify it. And then from there is no specific timeline in which they are supposed to do it. Because if you look at Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and DRC, most of it happened almost like 3 months or 2 months after it had been admitted. The respective legislative parliament had approved it. So if by next week the upper house ratifies that, then we expect probably normally it happens around June, because the next ordinary summit is on June, the heads of state summit. So in June, then Somalia will fully have joined the East African community. Then the next modalities of joining the customs union will now set into place. So for now, maybe my colleague, Dr. Bashir, will touch on it, but this is not the first time Somalia is applying to join the East African community. The first time was in 2012. Coincidentally, it is the same current president who applied in 2012 to join the EAC. So clearly, ideologically, or his political leanings is always geared towards the East African community. But number two, one glaring feature that people normally don't care to focus on is, however much the EAC tries to portray itself as a people-centered, it is still heavily reliant on how presidents relate. Just 2 years ago, when Somalia had a very different president, Farmajo, The relationship between him and the former Kenya President Uhuru Kenyatta was very frosty. I don't think Farmajo had any idea of joining the East African community whatsoever. In fact, he was leaning towards creating a new union between Eritrea, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. They consider themselves as the true horn of Africa. The rest of the other countries are not. So it is very good to see that the current president of Somalia, Hassan Sheikh, he has a very good relationship with Kenya, Uganda, to a large extent, Tanzania, and the rest of the East African members. Now, the biggest, for you to join EAC, you also need somebody to, it's like a private members club. You need somebody to nominate you. In this current situation, President Museveni has been the biggest cheerleader for Somalia joining the East African community. And we can debate on Museveni's motivations for pushing for Somalia. It all has to do with security. Uganda People's Defense Forces has quite a large contingent within the AMISOM now is transitioned to ATMIS. Kenya, the same, has stationed troops in Somalia. So with the ongoing geopolitical competition and the realization that Somalia will never be in chaos forever, in my opinion, I think it is better for the EAC to try and capture them early, as opposed to wait for them to stabilize 10 years later. And many other global powers have already shared the pie, and the EAC will never have an opportunity. So it is an ongoing process. And as we continue the conversation, we can discuss more about the pros and cons of the membership and how the EAC benefits, how does Somalia benefit, and what are the multiple risks that come up with it.
Thank you so much for that. We are experiencing a few connection problems with Bashir, but he should be joining us back soon. But I want to follow up on what you were talking about. When you're talking about a country wanting to join the East African community, needing a sponsor, and in this case, Uganda being the sponsor of Somalia, I wonder, was there also an economic element to this? Because I know Uganda has a considerable population of Somalis who are also very entrepreneurial in the country.
So the debates around Somalia joining the EAC has taken a totally different angle. I mean, if you read social media, especially from the Kenyan side, I haven't followed the social media of other countries, other member states, but the Kenyan one turned mostly xenophobic, of course. This is mostly because of the activities of the terrorist group Al-Shabaab, you know. The conversation on social media was like, we are opening it up, we are opening up the region for, you know, ABCD. But the reality is, I think Onyango Obo wrote in the East African sometimes back that in reality, it is not the East African community welcoming Somalia to the EAC. Somalia has always been in the EAC. In fact, it is a glove-fit member of the EAC. The Somali diaspora, if you cut across, there is no country among the partner states that doesn't have a burgeoning entrepreneurial Somali diaspora. If you go to Uganda, for instance, the biggest sugar factories in Uganda are owned by Somalis, okay? I come from a border district in Bungoma. We grew up knowing that the biggest entrepreneurial business magnate, she's a Somali woman. So they are not new to the East African community. I mean, what simply Museveni did is for you as a state, and because of the historical realities of Somalia, I mean, having not had a central government since the fall of Siad Barre in 1991, they needed a lot of support from existing partner states, and specifically Kenya and Uganda. Those are the original members of the EAC. So on the economic aspect, the reality is the Somali diaspora population is scattered everywhere. You can add on, because of the security situation, the refugee problem. It's a reality that the EAC has to grapple with. So it is purely glove fit. And look at the geographical proximity. It shares one of the longest borders with Kenya. So if you're going to lock it out from joining the EAC, I think you really have to be more creative in coming up with a very stringent measure. And as I said earlier, those measures outlined in the treaty, none of the EAC partner states fulfills all of them. So it is actually very important for Somalia to join the EAC as it is at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So let me just continue with this conversation and along the lines of what benefits is Jumuiya offering Somalia? If it was always about, I think the statement was, oh no, I've forgotten the exact expression, but what are we offering Somalia as the East African community?
So there are many benefits of joining the East African community. Number one is the free movement of both labor and goods. For the longest time, and even up to now, it's actually very difficult to quantify the trade imbalance or the trade between Somalia and multiple countries. So you can, if you use the existing trade matrix, you can lose so many variables out of it. But one thing the state of Somalia and the Somali people have suffered a lot is discrimination in all aspects. So the EAC offers them a pathway. Once they join the EAC, the East African passport, they will have access to the East African passport, right and center. They will be treated. Is the security reality of Somalia, nobody is paying attention. AMISOM, now ATMIS, is winding down. It has, I think, less than 6 months or so to close chapter. The biggest contributors to AMISOM or to ATMIS is Uganda and Kenya, and to a small extent, Ethiopia. With the realities happening now between Ethiopia and Somalia, whom do they need for the support? Al-Shabaab, as much as the Somali National Army has had a great impact in terms of gaining advantage from some of the areas controlled by Al-Shabaab, the reality is the Somali National Army is not yet ready to protect the territory of Somalia as a state. So the truth is, as the biggest contributors, with the closure of the East African Regional Force in the DRC, it is expected that once ATMIS closes down, there is no way the Kenya Defense Forces are going to pull out in the process because ATMIS has done so. There is no way the Uganda People's Defense Force will pull out because ATMIS is winding down. These two countries will maintain their security forces because the security situation in Somalia is inextricably linked to the internal security of Kenya and Uganda. I mean, in the past, we've seen how the spillover activities of Al-Shabaab have ended up affecting the internal security. So security-wise, the EAC is telling Somalia, look, ATMIS is winding down. There is donor fatigue in funding peacekeeping missions, as we've seen in the DRC MONUSCO. In the East African community, there is some level of communality that you benefit from us. We shall fill in the vacuum, and that vacuum is very important at the moment, okay? Then number 3 is to aspects of trade. As I said, Somalia has become a conduit for smuggling, and many at times the state or the government has not benefited because of the porosity of the borders. Once the EAC offers it, once Somalia accedes to the customs union, there are many benefits it will have to accrue from trading fairly with other partner states. And then, of course, with the ongoing geopolitical interest, and I think this one was predicted, the current squabble with Ethiopia over maritime, it's a perfect example that it will have a bigger bargaining platform because it will have backing from the other neighboring states on negotiating with the encroachment of its territory. So there are many benefits each Somalia can offer Kenya, and Kenya can, East African community, and East African community can offer Somalia. We can debate on the pros and cons. Of course, there are risks. I think the risks will come later. But for now, the EAC and Somalia, I believe, from where I sit, it's a very mutually beneficial partnership that should not be looked at from a very tiny aspect of security. Security is a very big issue, yes, but the benefits outweigh the risks at the moment.
Thank you. I think just in summary, could you maybe give a background of what is happening between Somalia and Ethiopia for people who do not know?
Oh, so the beginning of this month, or mid this month, Ethiopia signed a memorandum of understanding with Somaliland. where they were granted, I think, a 20-kilometer strip to build its naval base. And for the longest time, Somaliland has been agitating for secession from the Federal Republic of the federal government of Somalia, which hasn't been successful. And within the neighborhood, no state has recognized Somaliland yet. It is believed that the MOU between Ethiopia and Somaliland had a caveat where Ethiopia will formally recognize Somaliland. And that has created, the Horn of Africa has always had multiple tensions left, right, and center. But the threat of violent repercussions of this MOU between Somalia and Ethiopia, it has brought back the old conversation which happened in Ethiopia internally. If you go back in 1993, when Eritrea secedes, Ethiopia loses the port. And the joke at the moment that it's one of the largest countries, I think, in the world that is landlocked. So internally, for Ethiopians, any person who promises them a sea who is seen as a messiah. It's a very nostalgic and very emotive conversation in Ethiopia about the sea, yeah? And in fact, the short-lived camaraderie between Eritrea and Ethiopia was so short-lived because I don't think Isaias Afwerki was willing to give them back access to the sea, the port of Assab, yeah? And then, of course, Djibouti, now they have to rely on Djibouti for most of their trades. So this is not the first MOU Abiy Ahmed, the current Prime Minister of Ethiopia, is signing with Somaliland. Previously, there was an MOU they signed for the use of the port of Berbera, but it was exclusively for trade. Now, that MOU went dormant. It is reliably confirmed that actually it is Ethiopia that reneged on that agreement. That's why that deal went quiet. Unfortunately, the internal contradictions of the Ethiopian state, the pressures Abiy is facing because of the multiple insurgencies happening. There's the Fano, there's the Amhara, there's the Oromia, there's the Tigray. There's a lot of internal pressures. And of course, the aftershock of the COVID-19 and the way the economy is grinding to a halt, he needed a conversation that will excite the masses. And access to the sea is one of those nationalist sentiments that everybody who comes around with will rally the community together. So it has created a lot of tension between Somalia and Ethiopia. And because of that, now the whole region is grappling to, are we going to witness a violent incursion? Will Ethiopia forcefully enforce the MOU? And now with Somalia being the member of the EAC, what will the rest of the EAC do? Of course, all of it is hurtling towards a settled negotiation. But recently, when the Somali Aviation Authority stopped and refused to give access to the Ethiopian delegation, it kind of shows that Mogadishu's central government is actually working. In fact, that they can stand up against a belligerent, strong neighbor and engage in them stopping from accessing their territory. It shows with the necessary support, the Ethiopian Somali sovereignty has to be respected, okay? So this is not the first time Somalia is squabbling with any neighbor over the territory. You remember that Kenya and Somalia squared it up in the ICJ over the maritime dispute, which up to now, it has gone silent. We don't know if they will ever sit down and now agree as per the ICJ ruling. So many countries have treated Somalia with a lot of contempt. The lack of organized central government has allowed neighbors to always do things that will, which we hope that effort should be made towards making the central government much stronger instead of chipping away the territory as it's being done at the moment. So in reality of that, the Horn is becoming very restive. So Ethiopia is squabbling with Eritrea, Sudan is in turmoil, Somalia hasn't settled yet. So it lends into the critics keep on asking what value is Somalia adding to the EAC if with all the things that we're witnessing in that area.
Thank you so much. I can see Bashir has been able to join us. Bashir, how are you? I hope you can hear us and we can hear you. Please confirm.
I can hear you.
Thank you so much. Welcome back. Sorry for the connection problem. So Wekesa was just taking us through the application process and requirements that state wishing to join the East African community has to go through. And we talked a bit about what Jumuiya, the East African community, is offering Somalia, and what states like Uganda had to gain by sponsoring a Somali membership to the East African community. And you are more familiar with the internal procedures in Somalia concerning Somalia's engagement with regional economic blocs and the outside world. So would you explain to us the application process that Somalia underwent? What are the legal requirements that were followed? What were fulfilled? What need to be fulfilled? Is Somalia a full member of the East African community now? Wekesa was just mentioning that a vote at the upper house of the Somali parliament is yet to happen to confirm the accession decision. So yeah, I would just like you to help us understand what went on internally.
Okay, I thank you. I'm sorry I had a technical issue, so I finally am back. With regard to the upper house not having acted on the accession and ratification of the treaty itself, I think the Somali constitution requires only the lower house to ratify and treaties. So that may be complete. I will check that. I think that may have been completed already. With regard to the process, it was not well publicized what Somalia had to do to go to become a member. What we know is that Hassan Sheikh was very keen in having Somalia join the communities of countries around us, in particular the EAC, and he has been trying ever since he became the president the first time 10, 12 years ago now. With regard to his successor, Farmajo, predecessor now, he wasn't really keen much about Somalia joining EAC. So there is some political dynamic going on there that kind of says something about the individual president's desires. Now, we know that Somalia was examined, the economic of Somalia was examined by the EAC and was satisfied, but what I don't know is how the EAC summit addressed the question of whether Somalia should join beyond the economic side, whether Somalia should join the EAC, given that, for example, under Article 3 of the treaty itself, it requires adherence to universally acceptable principles of good governance, democracy, rule of law, observing human rights, and social justice. And many people would say that Somalia's government doesn't satisfy much of those requirements. So perhaps the summit is hoping that Somalia will move in the right direction and satisfy those requirements. From the economic side, Somalia does seem to have satisfied all the requirements that has been put in its place in front of it. Now, personally, what I'm hoping is that the desire to become integrated into the community will help Somalia, will spur Somalia into acting and building institutions. And this gets into your question of is Somalia really a full member? And the answer to that is no. Well, Somalia is a member of Somalia has been accessed or has been admitted into the membership, but the EAC treaty is not self-executing itself. It requires additional actions in addition to the ratification of the treaty itself. Somalia is required to go through 2 additional steps. The first one being implementation, which essentially means as a new member, Somalia is required to adopt all the laws of the EAC and pass. If, for example, there is EAC law that doesn't exist in Somalia, Somalia is required to pass that law. If an EAC law differs from Somali's law, Somalia is required to amend its law to match with that EAC. So Somalia hasn't gone through any of that. It's going to take a while for us to go through it. For example, I can give you 2 examples of laws that exist in EAC and don't exist in Somalia. The first one is the rule of origin, which is key to the first stage of the integration. And the other one is competition law. Both of them are the EAC law. EAC laws exist in both of them, but Somalia doesn't have either one of them. So Somalia would have to pass those, and Somalia would have to go through all its laws and match them with those of the EAC. So that's the next stage. The Somalia will be truly a member of EAC when it starts integrating into the first stage. The EAC has 4 different stages. The first one, which I consider to be the foundation of EAC, is the common customs or customs union. Yeah, the customs union. And the customs unions come with all kinds of processes and procedures and regulations that Somalia needs to pass and adapt for it to actually get into that stage. The first being the rule of origin. Rule of origin essentially would divide all the products that moves around inside EAC into 2: products that belong to EAC or EAC member, and products that do not belong to EAC member. If they are not EAC product and they are coming from outside, they have its own tariffs, what's called common external tariffs will apply. If they are internal products made by any EAC member and it's moving around with the EAC, then it attracts different tax regime, which eventually is meant to become zero once the EAC reaches the second stage. So speaking of the stages, when I think of EAC, I think of it as a house. When you're building a house, you build a foundation first, and then you build the wall and put the roof on, and then you go inside and you fix inside. I view the customs union to be the foundation of EAC. You have to get it right that stage for EAC to actually mature and become something. Once you have that, you can build the walls and the roof, which is the common markets, which I believe Kenya and Uganda together have reached now or about to reach. And then once you have that, you can build the inside of the house, which is getting the common currency and common and the federation. So Somalia will need first to get to the first stage, develop customs union, develop the rules of origin, develop what's called harmonized code, where every single product that gets exported or imported into Somalia gets a 6-digit code that the entire community uses right now. And once that's established, then we can talk about the CET or common external tariffs and the internal tariffs. So Somalia will have to do all that kind of stuff. And also then we'll have to match the processes that EAC ports now use. So Somalia is expected to adapt to what, for example, Mombasa is doing now, so that anything that gets imported, any port in Somalia gets imported into it, just like products are imported or exported from Mombasa. And you can see how arduous that process will be. I don't foresee Somalia getting to that stage completely for at least the next 10 years.
Thank you so much. That's so insightful. Now that we're talking about this, I was hoping you could also tell us what is Somalia gaining from joining the East African community? What motivated Somalia to join the East African community?
I think it's primarily the desire of Hassan Sheikh in bringing Somalia out of where it has been for the last 30 years, which really in some diaspora, out of the communities of the world. So I think with the stage with other countries in the region, like Kenya and others in the EAC, I think that's his primary desire for joining the EAC. Secondary desire would be there is a tendency right now all over the world in having blocks of trade blocks all over the world. So not joining EAC will essentially make Somalia isolated from trading with its neighbors. So that alone also would be a good reason for Somalia to join the EAC. Now, Somalia may not be economically as robust as Kenya and Tanzania in particular, but once these skirmishes that are going on subside, Somalia can actually become a viable economic center where some companies in East Africa may actually move to. And in fact, Somalia has fairly robust corporations that now run almost everything, because everything in Somalia right now is private. There's nothing the government controls right now. So businesses cover all that stuff. So I think there will be a lot of benefit for the community itself and for Somalia to be part of the community. And given also the fact that Somalia is connected to the Gulf of Aden, which gives the community access to that part of the world, if once the region becomes more stable.
Thank you. Yeah, because that means extended access to the sea for East African community members and access to the Red Sea, actually.
Yep.
And I would also think that Somalia and parts of northern Kenya, for instance, have pastoralist communities who provide a lot of livestock for trade, and that would be an addition to the East African community.
Yeah. One is the security issues in the region, in particular the border between Kenya and Somalia is dealt with. I can see people moving in and out of the border and moving their goods around. So I can see a robust movement of goods in there.
Thank you so much. So in about maybe 10 minutes, we're going to open it up for question and answer. I just wanted this conversation to form the foundation. But my last few questions to the both of you is, Wekesa had talked about what Jumuiya offers Somalia, and he looked at the what that means economically, and also what that means security-wise, seeing that Somalia member states of the East African Community contribute troops to AMISOM, which is now ATMIS, and whose term is over. But also we have the shared, at least Kenya, Uganda, and Somalia have the shared problem of Al-Shabaab. But also there's the current situation between Somalia and Ethiopia regarding the MOU Ethiopia signed with Somaliland, which Wekesa also gave a background on. And so I'm looking at the security implications, because the East African Community is a trading bloc, which means it was founded with the intention of it being primarily an economic bloc and culturally for cultural integration. But now we're seeing a move towards security, a security focus of the East African Community. Would Somalia, especially in light of what is going on right now with Ethiopia, expect the East African Community to support it security-wise?
I suppose so, given that EAC has already, EAC has been supporting DR Congo on its security issues. I would think Somalia would have similar expectation if there is a need for it. Right now, I know Kenya has presence in Somalia on its own in southern part of Somalia, and with the ATMIS in both ways, I think. But I think there is a mutual interest in making, especially that corridor that connects Kenya and Ethiopia, secure from Shabaab. So I think it would be best interest to Kenya to work with Somalia in figuring out how to deal with Shabaab and cooperate in dismantling them and remove them from the region. Now, ATMIS has a deadline. I think it's coming up in a year. I think end of this year or mid next year, somewhere there. ATMIS's time may expire. My suspicion is there will be some extension, and Kenya will probably be part of any extension that takes place, if any. But I think that I can still see Kenya and Somalia having to work together in figuring out how to deal with Shabaab in the region.
Thank you so much. So I have a question to the both of you, and Wekesa, I think I will begin with you. Of course, we have the ultimate goal of the political federation, the most elusive goal, objective of the East African community. And I'm wondering what the prospects of that are right now, in the context of this Somalia discussion, especially because of the fact that we saw the reception Somalia got when it acceded to the EAC treaty. From Jumuiya citizens, there was division. Some supported it, some were not in support of it. Some think that there is not much to share culturally between Somalia and the rest of the members of the East African community, which would inhibit integration. So I would like you to comment on that, and then Bashir, you will follow with it. You will also give us your comment on this, but also specifically focusing on the sustainability of Somalia's membership in the East African community, seeing that there were also internal divisions in Somalia concerning Somalia's accession, and the fact that public opinion within Somalia indicates that public participation may not have happened prior to Hassan Sheikh's decision to accede to the EAC. So I think we will start with Wekesa.
Thank you. You've summed it up nicely. Of course, there is an ongoing debate on whether the East African community should be expanded to include these so many interested countries. Some argue that the EAC should now concentrate on the current membership, consolidate the gains of integration amongst the new few states before opening it up. But you have to go back and look at how the existing partner states of EAC are behaving. Of course, Somalia is the least prepared of all the new partner states to join the EAC. But as I said earlier, it is in very good company because we have partner states that are free riding the membership of the EAC. Sudan, South Sudan and Burundi, South Sudan still owes EAC $27.4 million. And then Burundi owes the EAC $7.4 million. So, as I said, Somalia is in very good company. I mean, we shouldn't look at it as the black sheep of the family. The rest of the member states are also free riding. Okay. But what I'm foreseeing in the future is what we are witnessing in, I think Dr. Bashir will touch on it, and I think I had a side chat with him. What happens if, knowing very well how the EAC is built on personal friendships, what will happen if, for example, Farmajo comes back to power? Okay? Or what we are witnessing between DRC and Rwanda. The treaty hasn't been tested by any member wanting to leave. Of course, the treaty, if you look at the Vienna Convention, which gives the whole criteria of how you can terminate, a treaty, the EAC hasn't been tested yet. But because of the fluidity of the change of leadership in this region, I have a feeling that it's going to be tested soon. Because it has to be noted that we have 3 member states who have a mutual defense pact in EAC: Uganda, Kenya, and Rwanda, all signed and ratified. Everybody is waiting. What will happen if DRC invades Rwanda? What will Kenya do? What will Uganda do, for example? Will they defend Rwanda because they have a mutual defense pact? You flip over the other side. Kenya and Ethiopia have a long-standing mutual defense pact signed between Haile Selassie and the Jomo Kenyatta up to today. In fact, yesterday, the Minister of Foreign Affairs was in Addis for the Joint Ministerial Cooperation, which means they are reviewing it. Then you move to the other side. Every analyst has been crying to Kenya to enter into a mutual defense pact with Somalia. So it's a whole moving parts. And the big question we should ask ourselves is, are we going to face what ECOWAS is facing after we saw the 3 junta-led states declare that they're exiting ECOWAS? Will we foresee a scenario where a new regime change in Somalia will be like, you know what? We are not part of this thing and we need to exit. And also the treaty gives a whole criteria on how to exit, and what have you. So for me, I'm looking at the future. And we saw how EU was shaken by Brexit. That one went to a referendum. Ours, we don't have a referendum per se. That's why I'm always of the view that apart from just the normative framework of saying the EAC is a people-centered organization, the EAC needs to respond to the times and change. Let's take an example of representation. If you look at how the East African legislative members are elected, especially in Kenya, it's a joke. You know, if we tried to open up the process, perhaps to the people to vote directly, whereby candidates go and campaign, sell their manifesto to the people, then the society will understand what the EAC does and what the EAC doesn't do. But when people sit in the capitals of Nairobi, select their relatives, select and everything and go to EAC, you end up having that the farther you move away from to the hinterland, people don't understand how the EAC works. And again, I was chatting with Dr. Bashir asking the perception of the people in Somalia. The reason why we are having all this xenophobic perception that all this name calling about the Somalis coming to East Africa is because people don't understand how this organization works. And the EAC, the Secretariat, and the heads of state summit has totally failed to transform that organization to be. If you compare to EU, the members of the European Parliament, there's a whole lot of work that they do. Yeah. Here, if you asked a Kenyan on the street to name 5 members of the East African Legislative Assembly from Kenya, they don't know who those people are. So how are you promoting a people-centered regional integration when the citizens themselves don't even understand what is going on? So I think the EAC is going to be tested in the near future. And with the overlapping membership, we have Tanzania as a member of SADC. When Pierre Nkurunziza was still president of Burundi, Burundi applied to join SADC. It was rejected. We've seen the ping pong DRC is playing. It pivots to EAC when it suits them. When things don't go well, it runs back to SADC, you know? And now, it's everybody has a divided loyalty. So my look at it is it's this integration model and the whole community that they call it a community of good neighborliness is going to be tested, especially with the ongoing geopolitical competitions among the different states. So that's an area to look at. What will happen if one state exists? What will the rest of the people do? Or what will happen if 2 member states threaten to go at war with each other? What do the rest of the member states do? I think that's how the EAC is not looking at it that way, but time is coming.
Thank you. Bashir, would you like to comment on the same question?
Yeah, I would. With regard to people-centeredness, I don't think the process of accession of Somalia into EAC was people-centered in Somalia. I don't recall ever seeing any town hall or public discussion that involves the government about whether Somalia should join EAC or not. There are people who talk about it in some public places on their own, and a lot of times those people reason. They are just against it because they are against accession. So their opinion is often limited to the fact that accession is doing it and therefore they should be against it. So I don't put a lot of value in there. Now, with regard to the possibility of what Farmajo may do if he were to become the president, I think before we even deal with that, we should appreciate that EAC is modeled after EU. EU wasn't really structured the way it ended up being early on. It evolved over time, whereas EAC was planned to be structured the way EAC, the way EU has the process EU has gone through, but planned at one spot. To deal with the fact that the summit has only agreed things on unanimity, they have the EAC adopted what's called the principle of asymmetry, which EU also has. That principle essentially allows each partner state to integrate into the community as much as it wants. So in other words, the fact that Somalia had been admitted doesn't mean Somalia will immediately, in fact, be part of any of the stages. So whatever each country wants to do is what they will do. So that principle will slow down the process. And in Europe, the United Kingdom being part of the EU has been using its own currency when they were part of the EU. And that's because of that principle itself. The EU, just like EAC is doing now, was allowing countries to choose how much integration they are willing to take. The same thing is with Switzerland. Switzerland, once EU got to the point of a single market, they stopped integration. They didn't go beyond that. So that principle allows EAC not to have to go all the way to the federation. So Somalia could actually join the customs union, integrate into the community with customs union, become part of single market, and then stop. And remain part of the single market, but won't be part of any federal or any currency. Somalia could choose that. So that alone allows countries to actually strategically decide how far up they want to go in the integration process. Now, we should also remember it took many years for Europe to go from a single market to a federal level. They went through decades between that transition happening. And given that in East Africa, we learned governance from the European colonial powers, you would expect that what had taken that long would take us at least just as long, if not more. So I personally don't anticipate a proper federal EAC will get a foothold in the next 2 or 3 decades. I don't foresee that happening. So I think it's a long drawn process, and a lot of things can change along the way. Now, with Farmajo coming to power, I honestly can see him saying we're out. But that won't test EAC really, because we are not in anyway. We're just admitted we haven't really integrated into the community at all. So the community doesn't have to do anything. You will just tell Somalia, figure out what you want to do. If you want to integrate, integrate. If you don't. The community doesn't have to do anything.
That's interesting, and that actually tests the sustainability of both Somalia's membership and the EAC, the East African Community members right now. So final question, we're going to get into question and answer in about 5 minutes. So in 5 minutes, between the two of you, in 5 minutes, I would want you to just answer very briefly. Do you see an EAC expansion northwards in the future? The EAC expanded to South Sudan. The EAC has now expanded to Somalia. Do we see any other northward expansion to all the other IGAD states? I think we can start with Wekesa.
Ethiopia has mostly been rumored to be a candidate to join the East African Community. I think before the turmoil in Sudan had actually applied to join the EAC before Bashir was toppled over and the things are happening as they are now. But I think we can observe for the longest time, if you take Ethiopia, it was a very closed economy. I think with opening up for Kenya's telecom, Safaricom, to go in, Abiy has shown some kind of relaxing some of the previous stand that they had. And then there is the LAPSET project, that we don't know at the moment where it lies. Again, it was to bring up the countries, Ethiopia, South Sudan, access to the sea. Of course, expansion is going to happen. I think what states have realized is that thought to be one of the most advanced regional economic communities for no reason. It is absolutely the way it has worked, its modalities, and Dr. Bashir has gone on the different stages it is right now. Only the issue of the political federation seems to be, it's a hot potato to me, because they haven't agreed. If you read the WACO draft, the fast tracking committee that was done by the former Kenya Attorney General Amos Wako, the issue of the political federation, when they were canvassing for views around the region, it remained a very emotive and very divisive issue, mostly because of the concept of sovereignty. It is rumored that President Museveni wants to be the first president of the federation. Each person have their own personal ambitions here and there. So it's a very emotive conversation to have. And that's how they've changed it to do the confederation that they're doing at the moment as a precursor to before they go to have because the goal was 2030, I think, or 2035. I'm not sure. So EAC will expand. From where I sit, the first candidate, I feel like might be Ethiopia. Or, yeah, might be Ethiopia as the first candidate. Sooner or later, they will join. And if the IGAD members all the way to Djibouti, preferably, if the camaraderie between the leaders, the presidents continue to be nice, of course, EAC is bound to expand. I mean, if you look eastwards or southwards, if you look at, for example, towards now, DRC is now part of it, Sudan might be the other candidate if they get their act in order. So I don't think it's going to remain at 8 member states. It will expand in the near future.
Yes, Bashir.
Yeah, I agree. I think Ethiopia is probably the most likely candidate in joining EAC, although their colonial mentality may prevent them from coming down to the servants and being member of them. I think they view themselves as being superior to everybody else and not wanna be one of them. And of course, Sudan is probably not gonna be ready anytime soon. When I look at the map, actually, I look at the map to see what are the possible candidates. Central Africa is probably closest distance-wise, but I don't know if Central Africa would be a good fit for EAC. Maybe Zambia. I thought Zambia might be the one that could be closest to Tanzania in terms of the way the two countries are friendly to each other. Maybe that would be the one that's reasonable to go. Except I think they're a member of the South African Pact, so that may prevent them. But I suspect there may be actually 2 regions joining. Maybe that's the more likelihood, actually. The South Africa, the OMESA, is it called? And the EAC join the force and becoming one big region. That might actually be the route.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving us a solid background to this issue. I know I can see there are good questions already in the Q&A. I would like to, first of all, tell Bashir that welcome, Karibu to Jumuiya, welcome to the East African community. And we expect you to learn how to speak Kiswahili now. So I think I will begin with the questions in the question and answer, and then I can see a hand raised, and I will get to that hand in a minute. Joshua Musana is asking, in light of how the East African community is influenced a lot by the relations between the presidents, I am curious to hear your insights on what tensions between DRC and Rwanda bode for the East African community. Do you anticipate the departure of some EAC members? I think, Wekesa, this is something you had alluded to, so I would ask you to take note of that question. Harrison Mbohe is asking, what becomes of the Kenya-Somalia maritime dispute, its implications on Jumuiya, despite the ICJ ruling, which technically favored Somalia? I think recently when Hassan Sheikh was complaining about his reception in Addis Ababa, he talked about Kenya and Somalia having resolved their maritime disputes peacefully after the court decision. I don't know, but Bashir, I would like you to answer that question. Emily Osiemo is asking, what is the potential contribution of Somalia to strengthening of integration within the EAC? I would allocate that question also to Bashir. So we can start with those 3, and then you answer those 3, we'll go to the raised hand and go on with the other questions in the chat. Wekesa, I think you can begin.
Okay, thank you. The question in terms of relations between presidents in the EAC, yes, it's a factor. It really matters a lot, because if you look at the highest decision-making organ of the East African community is the Heads of State Summit. And the way the Heads of State Summit normally works, it works on consensus. So if one person doesn't give consensus, it kind of renders the whole community to a standstill. I mean, previously, I think we remember when the former Tanzanian President Jakaya Kikwete had a run-in with the Rwandan President Paul Kagame when Jakaya Kikwete suggested that perhaps Kigali should negotiate with the rebel groups in DRC that are known to attack them. And it creates, the EAC simply stalled because President Kagame never attended a single meeting until Jakaya Kikwete had to leave power, yeah? So we've had such moments when presidents disagree very badly, very bitterly. And I think President Kagame was quoted saying if he ever attended one of the summits, he will punch Kikwete in the face, you know? He was quoted saying that. And then fast forward, Burundi, the late Pierre Nkurunziza attended a summit. He was almost overthrown when he was in Arusha. He went back to Bujumbura. He never attended any of the meetings thereafter. And then now we are seeing Tshisekedi and Kagame at it again. Since they started squabbling, President Kagame hasn't attended a single summit where Tshisekedi is there. He always sends the prime minister. That relationship is very important. And if you go back and look the origins of the coalition of the willing between Kenya, Rwanda again, and Uganda, and isolating Kikwete, it was based on those relationships. Unfortunately, what is happening in the region is, as Ba Yoweri Museveni, who is the fixed asset and the grandfather of the community, is we are getting a new different breed of leaders, in my opinion, who don't value what this regional integration means. Historically, and I saw on Twitter the other day, some people questioning the contribution of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere and ABCD, and you start to shudder when people start asking such questions. A certain section of leaders understand what EAC is all about. A good number of them were shuttled across these capital cities during different times of their countries. When Kenya was under the dictatorship of Moi, the current group of leaders were running around the region. And what's because of this EAC that facilitated them to be able to move around. Unfortunately, Kenya has, because of its own democratic ideals, we are electing a certain group of leaders that do not appreciate and understand what this regionalism is all about. Their language, their tone, they are so detached from these community aspects. And it is, in my opinion, it is a danger. Yes, the leadership conveyor belt is nice, but our leaders are not grounded in most of these issues. And simply because, unlike a country like Tanzania that has a very good political party culture in CCM, or what Museveni has tried with the NRM in Uganda, if you read the manifestos of those parties, there is a whole chapter on regional integration. If you open the manifesto of UDA right now in Kenya, I think the thing on regional integration is only 3 lines. It shows how much they don't consider it seriously, you know? So the crop of leaders we are getting is they don't value the whole regional economic integration agenda. And that's a worry going forward. It's only and I can belabor on this conversation. If you look at what states, because one of the key requirements of the treaty is appoint a substantive minister for East African Community Affairs. Kenya is a joke. It's always they appoint the most clueless people for that position. The previous regime didn't even have a substantive minister for EAC. We had lumped up together with Labour. The current government, I don't even know who the name of the minister for EAC is. It shows the much contempt they treat these organizations with. And so that relationship with leaders, it remains a very, very complicated matter for EAC. Unless we start getting leaders who are ideologues, who understand this concept, I think we will end up treating the EAC as just one of the appendages of the community. So, as I said earlier, the treaty is going to be tested, you know? And again, somebody like Tshisekedi in DRC, his history is well known. He never lived in DRC. He grew up in Belgium. He doesn't understand what this thing is all about. So you get a group of leaders who don't understand what it is to be in a region that is in chaos. You don't have anywhere to go, but you have to go to your neighbor. You know, that will test, the treaty is going to be tested because I'm foreseeing a scenario where Tshisekedi will go back to his parliament and tell them, look, we are fed up with the EAC, we want to exit and go back to SADC, or so and so saying that's something. So I agree that I anticipate a threat to depart from the EAC because of the current tensions between leaders.
Thank you so much. And we will go on with this conversation on 7th March, Joshua. Bashir, you have the questions on maritime, the maritime dispute and contribution to integration.
Yeah, first with the contribution to integration, I think Somalia, with its border in Kenya, being populated primarily by Somalis, I think the integration, at least on ground, would be fairly smooth. Now, so as I said earlier, Somalia is essentially run by corporations. Every single thing that happens in Somalia is done by companies. The government almost does nothing beyond security side. So a lot of those companies are itching to where to invest and do some business. And I think you will see a lot of them coming into East Africa once Somalia gets integrated into the community. And I think that should be a catalyst for other East Africans to see that their neighbor is coming. They themselves would probably want to go to Somalia and see what business they can do, because there are businesses that are not in Somalia that may be thriving in Kenya or Tanzania or Uganda. So I honestly think if Somalia were to put its acts together and we were to start integrating to East Africa, I think it will trigger quite a reaction from East Africa, and there will be a lot of business movement when Somalia does that. Regarding the ICJ issue, I honestly don't recall ever hearing any resolution of it. All I remember is disagreement between and what should happen next between Kenya and Somalia. I think it got dormant only because Hassan Sheikh wasn't pushing it and he didn't bring it up in public. So it got dormant. I'm not sure though it has been resolved, despite what you may have said in Ethiopia that Somalia and Kenya have resolved that issue. I think that issue still is outstanding. It may not pop into out only because the area that's disputed is not very large compared to other areas in the region, in the area between both in Kenya side and Somali side, that have the resource that people suspected those areas may have. So it may take a while for it to pop up. And who knows if Somalia gets integrated into EAC, Kenya being its next neighbor, if that goes well, the issue may easily be resolved.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I saw a hand from Mr. Sambu. Okay. As we wait for him to be ready, I will go on to the other questions. Alex Tamei is asking, what about the concept of regional citizenship in the EAC? Considering the Refugee Act of Kenya 2021 allows refugees from partner states to give up their refugee status and accord themselves the protection of being EAC citizens, especially considering the vast majority of refugees in Kenya are of Somalian descent. I don't know who will answer this question, and either of you can. The other question is, when you think of Jumuiya, do you think of the end goal being a federation or simply an economic bloc? With an economic bloc being the end goal, more and more members is by and large a good thing. If a federation be the end goal, the potential trouble, be it from Somalia and the east of DRC, I think, or the east of DRC from the west, what meets Jumuiya would perhaps be a good thing. I think either both of you can also attempt this. You will let me know. The another question is to Dr. Wekesa, I think. My question stems from what Wekesa raised about the overlap of membership of EAC members with the other blocs. Tanzania is part of SADC, which has deployed troops in DRC after the DRC refused to extend the mandate of the East Africa Community Regional Force. Could this overlap portend crisis for the future of the EAC? Same question goes to the overlap of mandates between the East African Community and IGAD, yet not all EAC members are part of IGAD. How does this impact the EAC? I think I will give the first half of the question to Wekesa, this one. So you will handle SADC and EAC, and then Bashir, you will handle EAC and IGAD overlap. I think we can answer these three first.
Okay, the issue of regional citizenship in the EAC, it remains one of the key existing issues that none of the member states, it's a very, because of the fluidity of citizenship of the member states, it's a very tense conversation to have. You know, because you remember, I think there was a requirement for member states to register their citizens and have national IDs. I think so far only maybe 3 countries. I don't know if Somalia has done it. Maybe Dr. Bashir can clarify. But our big brother Tanzania, I don't think they have started that process, or they're in the process of doing it. So for Kenya specifically, the advent of an international security incident, especially terrorism, it coincided with all this discussion about regional citizenship. At a time when there was rampant corruption, the porosity of the borders, and the reports that the Kenyan immigration system was actually selling the national IDs to foreigners at a small, because of corruption, the process of regional citizenship remains quite, the EAC itself, the IALA hasn't had an opportunity to actually discuss it, because if you look at the situation of the border areas, the border between Kenya and Somalia, people getting IDs, it's still a very difficult process. And anybody who comes from a border area in this country will tell you that it's still not properly thought out. So the concept of an EAC citizen, theoretically, people say, oh, I'm an East African. The practicality of it, it's very difficult. We guard our sovereignty jealously, and it comes with the people in it. I will just combine with the two, and then Dr. Bashir can step in. In terms of the overlap of membership, it's not a bad thing. Competition is healthy. But when it comes to troop contributing countries, especially on issues to do with peacekeeping or peace enforcement, it is not the first time that we are having SADC deploy in Eastern DRC. In 2012, actually it was the SADC force that routed M23 out of Goma under the Force Intervention Brigade. And the contributing countries were Tanzania, Malawi, and again, South Africa. So it's not a new thing. What is happening at the moment is that many states and many troop contributing countries have realized that you cannot perpetually continue to fight for a country that is not reforming or doing security sector reform to its army. The problem with DRC is the lack of a disciplined army. These peacekeeping mission, this peace enforcement bodies, they will come, they will defeat M23, drive them out of the territory, and then you live for who? There's always a vacuum, you know? So, and I think the point of departure between ESRF and President Tshisekedi in particular was President Tshisekedi wanted the ESRF to play the role of the DRC army. And the ESRF told him, we are not willing to take body bags back to our countries. The SADC mission already, South Africa National Defense Forces has lost, I think, 3 personnel, which no sane-minded leader wants to send body bags back to their country. Okay, so the ESRF contributing countries said, no, we will not do that. But again, also the lack of a clear, open, and genuine conversation is also hampering and creating this appears that a tension between SADC and the EAC. If there was a genuine, coherent structure in terms of, okay, the Force Intervention Brigade had a better personnel, had a better infantry, had a better, weapon, then how do you combine with the East African Regional Force? Because as we speak, KDF has the Quick Reaction Force domicile under MONUSCO, okay? On the other hand, KDF is training FRDC in Kisangani. So you have a whole cocktail of actors in that area. And it's simply each country is looking out for its own interest. So the lack of a coherent strategy from all these regional economic communities, it leaves a gap for each member state to exploit for their own benefit. And in a nutshell, you end up creating more chaos than solving the current situation. So the competition is healthy, but it requires some clear pathway or some clear streamlining on the operations, the objectives, and the end game.
Thank you. Yes, Bashir.
Yeah, can you remind me the question?
Yeah, so there's a question on what happens if there's an IGAD EAC overlap, and then
Okay.
at the same time, I think the goal on whether the EAC, it's reasonable to pursue a political federation or just an economic bloc. Which one?
Okay.
What seems viable? Yeah.
Okay. Let me first make a comment on the ID side. Somalia had started providing IDs to people. I actually got my ID for the first time this past November. So there is an ID process now that's limited to the city of Mogadishu and maybe some other large cities. But I think the goal is to eventually to move into the countryside and give everybody an ID. I doubt if Somalis will have mostly IDs. I would doubt if more than 30% of Somalis will have ID anytime soon. So that's that. With IGAD, I think it's actually very easy because IGAD is not an economic bloc. IGAD is a political bloc. So I don't think there is a competition in what IGAD does and what the EAC wants to do. I think they're completely different places, except when EAC reaches a federal level, maybe at that point it will compete with IGAD, because at that point, presumably at least, EAC would have a governing body that sets the agenda for all the countries in the bloc itself. So when some countries like Somalia are a member of IGAD, and IGAD would want to set some agenda for them, and then they're part of EAC, in a federal EAC, then you can see some conflicts popping up. But I think the fact that EAC is much larger and has an economic angle that's much too important, I think IGAD may actually not be viable much longer than it is, especially given that Somalia and Ethiopia are being loggerheads unless that relationship changes. And because if you take out one of them, then suddenly you're looking at reducing from 5 to 4, and if you do that, you can go downhill. With regard to EAC, as I said earlier, I honestly don't think EAC will reach anytime soon the federation level. And any fear of whether federalism between these 8 countries would work or not, or whether one country may not want to be part of it, I think that's answered by the principle of asymmetry that EAC had adopted. So if a country chooses not to be part of the federal system, they can choose not to be part of the federal system and staying within the economic bloc. I think the economic bloc will materialize within the next decade or so, especially between Kenya and Uganda and possibly Tanzania. But the federal system may take much longer. We're gonna have to experiment first with the confederation, which we all know is not really a government; it's more of an agreement between countries. So it doesn't really do anything good for anybody.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Mr. Sambu, you can proceed to ask your question.
Now, are you hearing me?
Yes.
I had the entire conversation. Thanks a lot for the knowledge they have and they're really up to speed with East African community affairs. My biggest question was what somebody asked about the maritime dispute between Kenya and Somalia, 1, and 2, now that Turkey may be coming on board, what does that say about the Western world and the relationship with the region? That is the second question. Then finally, all along, cheap imports have been coming through Somalia because of a government whose governance system are not up to speed then. It has been known to be very porous. That will then distort the trade in the other East African countries, especially Kenya, where they have a very huge porous border. And now, since Rashid said that Somalia is basically run by companies and not government, what does this portend in terms of security now of goods coming to Kenya that are uncustomed and therefore cheaper and distorting the economy of East Africa? Thank you so much.
Yeah, Bashir, I think you can answer
Yeah.
those questions.
No, I didn't mean to say the country is run by companies. What I meant to say is most of the services are privately provided. The government is essentially limited to security side of the equation. It doesn't have, for example, schools are run, schools are for the most part private schools, even from kindergarten through high school through college. Everything is private. There is a Somalia National University at the university level. I think there may be some lower middle and high schools in some of the regions, but the capital city barely has anything public in education. So that's what I meant when I say corporations are mostly doing most of the legwork that the government used to do. Now, with regard to the border and how that border is porous, yeah, the border is very porous because it's written by people who want to take advantage of the chaos that exists in Somalia. So it's going to take a while for Somalia to take full control of that part of that border between Kenya and Somalia. And I know Kenya has been struggling how to deal with it. And one time there was an announcement that the border will be opening, and then there's nothing that happened. I think there is a thinking about whether that border should be open from Kenyan side. So that border being open is a problem, both security side and it skews what economic business that is between Somalia and Kenya, because none of it is recorded anywhere. But that issue of not having businesses fully recorded is quite prevalent in Somalia, again, because the government doesn't have the power to deal with all those issues. But one is that government, if we get rid of the Shabab and the government gets its legging, I suspect that all those things will change slowly, and eventually we'll get to the point where the government would know what happens at the border side.
Thank you. So I think some questions have been answered, like the possibility of other countries in the Eastern African region joining the EAC. And I think we have also answered the issue of the security issue posed by Al-Shabaab and how that can be addressed by the EAC. So I think we will go to Mikhail Nyamweya. I will go to Mikhail Nyamweya, Felix and Nyanje first, before I come back to those who have already asked their questions. So what mechanism would Somalia use to elect representatives to the East Africa Legislative Assembly? Would Somalia emerge distinctly in terms of actively involving its citizens in electing these representatives directly? Wekesa mentioned that Somalia should not be viewed as the black sheep. Does it mean that we would see a shift with Somalia in this regard? So Wekesa and Bashir, I think you both should answer that question. Felix says, my question delves on the issue of states of the security of East Africa with the onboarding of Somalia to Jumuiya on the aspect of cross-border movement. How will the threat of transnational terrorism and firearms trade impact the state of security of the region? And then Nyanje says, why is this whole question around what does Somalia gain and what do the others gain? Is that even the core issue of the East African community? Is the East African community not just like Chinua asks, sorry, when kingsmen invite each other, it's not because there is food or moonlight at their homes. So I think we can do this fast and then we can finish. We actually have maybe 10 minutes to finish the question and answer session before we close the webinar. So I would ask you to be brief.
Let me take the first question of how Somalia would elect. The question of whether citizens would elect, I think, is at the moment out, because citizens don't even elect the president. So I don't see how that would happen. More likely, it will be appointed by the president and approved by the Council of Ministers through the parliament. I think that would be the process that Somalia would likely take. Whether that process will produce people who would be competent enough to represent Somalia, that's a different story that we can debate later on. Okay, so on the security side.
Okay, so I'll combine Mikhail's question and Nyanje's very philosophical question, as asking what does Somalia gain or what does the EAC gain? I think from where I sit and from where I look at it is that if you look at perhaps the basic definition of regional integration is where two or more nation states agree to cooperate on either peace, stability, or the economy. And I think for the longest time, ever since the collapse of the Siad Barre regime, Somalia has been treated as the poster child of a failed state globally. I mean, it's always ranked poorly in all the indices. You can think of any. Somalia is always ranked at the bottom. But if you look at the whole idea of people speak about state resilience, how will you say the state has collapsed? There's a whole debate on state collapse and the whole concepts around it. Then if it's collapsed, how have the citizens of that society been functioning all these years with all these things of the state collapsing? So I think the neighbors woke up to the realization that, look, if you view Somali from a strong man or woman sitting in Mogadishu and pulling levers, we will never relate with them at an equal level or whatever level it is. So I agree with you that we shouldn't be looking at Somalia from a very extractive and very, what is this word, very exploitative nature that we are going to get something from them and they're coming to get something from us. I think it should be more of a mutual beneficial to each other. Do they need each other? Absolutely, yes. Is that there modalities they can work around it on how to benefit from it? Absolutely. And it will go a step further that they will view Somalia from a different perspective. The narrative will change. We will stop looking at them as security threats and see them as normal citizens, you know? Turkey, you can take Turkey as an example. I think Turkish Airlines is the single most international, now Kenya Airways has joined the fray, to fly to Mogadishu. They took the risk long time ago. And I'm sure if you went to the streets of Mogadishu and asked between the Turks and they will choose the Turks because the Turks cast their lot with the Somalis. As much as their interests are very selfish, they cast their lot and put in a higher risk long time ago. The rest of us and the Regional Economic Committee is trying to catch up. So I agree, we shouldn't look at it from that very narrow perspective of what can we extract? Can we extract gold? Can we get oil? Or they have a 3,000 coastline? Or it is a realization that actually these are also citizens of the world and there is need for them to be integrated into the whole regional economy and what have you.
Thank you. I think there's the outstanding question of cross-border movement of arms. We will bundle that up with the last remaining questions, which I will ask you to answer in about 5 minutes maximum between the two of you. If the EAC is to be pursued as an economic bloc, what should be done to fast track a common currency to facilitate trade? Is the EAC expansion sustainable considering the debt arrears of partner states and backlog of cases before the EACJ, which is yet to have a permanent seat? And Harrison asks, the ruling, the disputed area was split in half to Kenya's disadvantage. Kenya repudiated the ruling. I think that's more of a comment, Harrison. And if we get time, we will come to you, but to speak about it. But yeah, I think let's finish this session now. I don't know which one do you?
I will combine Felix Kipto's and the other one on the economic model. Yes, the reality is the proliferation of small arms and light weapons remains a big challenge for governments within this region. And it's not just a Somali problem at all. We have many countries across the region who have involved in a violent conflict one way or another. As I said earlier, Somalia is just the poster child of all these issues because of the lack of a central governing government in Mogadishu. However, onboarding Somalia to Jumuiya and the whole aspect of cross-border movement, the borderland communities have been interacted with each other, irrespective of this these poor governance situations in this country. So the threat of transnational terrorism will not be exacerbated because Somalia has been admitted to the EAC. It has happened before Somalia was admitted to the EAC. Yeah, so it will not change anything. In fact, it was worse when Somalia was outside the EAC. So preferably, now that we are treating them as equal citizens, maybe they will think, okay, these guys have stopped seeing us as terrorists and they see us as normal human beings, and then we can always engage with each other. In terms of the EAC as an economic bloc, there's an ongoing debate on what comes first. Is it security or development? Or is it the economic development first? So for the longest time, EAC fashioned itself as an economic bloc. But the realities of the region, where man shall not live and eat on economic development alone, the aspect of security became a very glaring deficit of the EAC, and they had to change their attitudes towards it. They had to come up with the peace and security protocol, which not all have ratified. So it was responding to the existing realities of the region. It is a very highly volatile region. And if you talk about the economy and leave the security alone, I don't think you'll be able to achieve what you tend to get. So EAC is being forced to respond to the realities of the day. That on one hand, its core mandate is the economic development. On the other hand, the reality is security is a key issue to achieve that economic development.
Thank you. Yes, Bashir.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay, good. Well, I think the security issue will remain so until Somalia's government finds its footing and the country's economy changes. Because a lot of the problems in Somalia are actually economic. It's not a security issue, really. It is people not having anything to do. And when you have a lot of free time, you will find a way to spend it. And so Mogadishu, for example, has a large number of young people who don't have any jobs. So it's not very difficult for those people to lose track of what's right and do something else. And as Wekesa was saying, guns are everywhere in East Africa, really. I think guns are prevalent in everywhere in where you go to, whether it's Kenya or Ethiopia or anywhere else. So it's not unique to Somalia. But I think the economic issues that the region has to deal with will probably be where the solution lies. If we can find a way to engage those people and make them do something useful, they will drift from it. Of course, there are some people who have ideology and can advance that ideology regardless of what they do. And it will be quite a challenge to figure out who's doing what and what anybody's up to. But it's something we cannot shrink from and say, okay, there is a security issue, therefore we do nothing. There's no integration, no economic activities going on here. I think, yeah, that's it, yeah.
Yeah, so let me squeeze in these questions because it comes from Tanzania. When you speak about Somalia here in Tanzania, people reflect their memories of Al-Shabaab, Mira, and illegal immigrants passing to South Africa through the porous border with Kenya. So how are we going to assure the Tanzanians Somalia will be as a friendly nation as Kenya and Uganda? And then we can see if we can also finish that with the question on debt arrears and a backlog of cases, and then we will close. So in 2 minutes. Yeah.
I mean, number one, I think for the Tanzanian nation, of course, it's not just the Somalia. Most Tanzanian citizens are very fearful, not just Somalia or Kenya. And if you're to speak about Al-Shabaab, I think Tanzania hasn't bore any brand of Al-Shabaab activities compared to Kenya and Uganda, for instance. So their fears are valid. And again, the person who asked the question has summed it up nicely. Tanzania is just a conduit to South Africa. They always go to South Africa. They don't even stop in Tanzania. So probably in the spirit of Nyerere and the spirit of Ujamaa and Undugu, maybe we need to start looking at Somalian people not as terrorists, but to look at them as normal human beings, and start embracing them. The factional terrorists are very few people. It's very wrong to label a whole society because of the activities of very few small-minded individual. So I think we need to dissuade ourselves from lumping the whole nation of people simply because of the active of a very small active group. You know, each country has its own people with some very weird ideas. But if we went ahead and labeling the whole society, we need to dissuade ourselves from this xenophobic labeling of citizens simply because of groups that do their own things on their own agenda. So our Tanzanian brothers need not to fear, because we as Kenya, which has bore the brunt of Al-Shabaab, we still embrace the Somali people as citizens, as normal human beings, as East Africans, and that's why we are at the forefront of inviting them. So fear not. Simply, they need to be more open-minded and more accommodating and seeing a situation where they can benefit as opposed to them being fearful.
And I think the other thing that needs to be added is the other thing to be added is Somalia has gone through a phase where every young person was running away from Somalia looking for opportunity elsewhere. I think that phase has ended. And a lot of Somalis are actually going back to Somalia because they see opportunities in Somalia that they can do well and do something for themselves. So I suspect in the next 5 to 10 years, you may not see many people going through Tanzania to go to South Africa, many Somalis doing that.
Thank you. Emily, I think we will answer this question. Let's answer this question on 7th March, because Somalia is still a new member and they don't have data arrears as it stands. We will deal with that with South Sudan, DRC, Burundi, and the other member states. Thank you so much for such an insightful discussion. I hope, thank you to the attendees for attending and for staying with us. We had very good attendance. I'm grateful to the panelists, Wekesa and Bashir, for making time to be with us here for over 2 hours. Thank you for sharing your insights on this topic. Wekesa has written on Somalia and the East African community before, I think almost 2-3 articles published by The Elephant. And Bashir wrote a very wonderful, I think about 32-page paper for Heritage Institute on anticipating Somalia's admission into the East African community that can explain a lot on the Somalia, if you need to understand how Somalia internally perceives this issue. So once again, welcome to the East African community, to Somalia, and to every Somalia citizen here. We will now go and close with a word of prayer from Elvis Mogesa. And just to remind you finally that the call for papers for the Jumuiya East African Community Law Journal is out. The deadline is 31st December and 30th June for both the long papers and the commentaries or reviews. Thank you. Yes, Elvis.
This webinar for the insightful ideas, for the insightful comments, discussions. We thank you, God, and may this not stop here. We will continue learning more and engaging for greater integration and helping this entire region of local God. In Jesus' name I pray and believe. Amen.
Yeah, thank you so much. Please feel free to exit now.